You people always have an excuse. Lieutenant Connor Vance said it loud enough that it carried down the hall. Dr. Ingrid Solberg was face down on her kitchen floor in zip ties. The sun was coming hard through the skylight. Her green top had twisted at the shoulder where they'd dragged her, and her jeans were pressed flat to the tile, which was cold. She had told them 7 times that they had the wrong address. 7. He crouched down close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath, and he smiled at her. Nobody's coming to save you. His team was already in the living room, boots scraping the hardwood, when one of his officers stopped moving. Just stopped. About 3 seconds of nothing. Then someone said, low, almost under her breath, "Lieutenant, you need to come in here, right now." Vance turned, saw Officer Tasha Monroe's face in the doorway, and whatever was on his own face started to fall apart. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. 5:47 in the morning. Most of Elmwood Hills was still asleep. Ingrid Solberg was already at her kitchen table. It was quiet outside in that particular way suburbs get after a couple of days of rain. Wet grass, birdsong, the oaks on Calder Street barely moving. Her house was the third from the corner. White siding, dark green shutters, a navy front door she'd picked herself off a stack of paint chips one Saturday a few years back. People who didn't know her sometimes thought she was cold. She wasn't. She was just careful. Everything in that house was there because she'd put it there on purpose, including the maple table she was sitting at and the reading lamp that was throwing warm light across the case files she'd printed the night before. Green top, jeans, reading glasses halfway down her nose. Black coffee, half gone, in a white mug to her right. She'd been at the table since 5. She was always at the table by 5. 19 years on the federal bench, and she had never walked into her courtroom less than ready, and she wasn't going to start today. The file in front of her was a civil conspiracy thing. 4 defendants, 900 pages of discovery, trial in 11 days, yellow legal pad on her left, notes in handwriting nobody else could read. She turned a page, drank some coffee, read. At 5:52, a mockingbird started up out in the back garden. She didn't look up, underlined something in red, wrote 2 words in the margin, turned another page. At 5:53 and 40 seconds, her front door came off its frame. She had never heard a sound like it in her own house. Not a knock, not a bell, not somebody's fist. It was a hard crack, then a low boom as the deadbolt went through the jamb, and then boots, more than she could count, hitting the foyer all at once. She was standing before she decided to stand. Legal pad on the floor, red pen gone somewhere under the table. Police, search warrant, get down, get on the ground. It wasn't talking. It was a wall of noise from everywhere at once. Her hallway was suddenly full of black vests, helmets, weapons, the white blaze of those helmet lights cutting through like something surgical and cold. She put both hands up. She was already saying it before the first one got to her. "I'm Dr. Ingrid Solberg. You have the wrong address. This is a mistake. You have the wrong—" The taser hit her mid-sentence, left side, just under the ribs. Everything she had ever thought went white. Her legs stopped working. The floor came up fast. She didn't really remember falling, just the tile against her cheek, her shoulder pressed into it, and the sound of her own breathing, which had somehow become the loudest thing in the room. Somebody grabbed her arm. Somebody else pulled her hands behind her back. The zip tie went on with one clean snap, and it bit her wrists in a way that told her whoever was doing it had done it a lot. The overhead kitchen lights were on now. The skylight above was pouring morning gold into the room, and the fluorescent strips were blazing full, and the combination made everything achingly, almost cruelly bright. bright enough that she could see every detail of the boots standing around her, the scuffed toes, the manufacturer's logo on one set of laces, the tile grout between the squares of her kitchen floor. She cataloged these things the way she had been trained to catalog evidence. She counted her breaths. She came back to herself the way she had always come back to herself, through discipline, through the deliberate reassembly of thought. "You have the wrong address," she said. Her voice was even. It cost her something to make it even, but she did. Nobody responded. Boots crossed the kitchen. A cabinet opened. A drawer pulled out, and its contents clattered against the countertop. In the hallway beyond the kitchen arch, she could hear more movement. Voices speaking in the clipped shorthand of a team running a protocol. She turned her head as far as she could without moving her bound arms. "My name is Dr. Ingrid Solberg. I am a United States District Court judge. You have the wrong address. I am asking you to verify the warrant address against the address of this property. You will find they do not match." Still nothing. The cabinet closed. Then Lieutenant Connor Vance walked into the kitchen. She knew he was the ranking officer before he said a word. It was in the way the other officers registered his presence without looking at him directly. A slight adjustment in how they moved. A molecular deference. He was in full tactical gear, long-sleeved uniform underneath, his name tape visible on the vest. He was not tall, but he carried himself with the particular posture of a man who had spent years in rooms where he was the most powerful person present. He looked down at her the way some men look at things on the floor that they have not yet decided are worth picking up. He crouched. He rested his forearms on his knees. He looked at her face the way she had seen witnesses look at evidence they had decided in advance was irrelevant. "You people always have an excuse," he said. She held his gaze. "You have the wrong address." He smiled. It was a patient smile. The smile of a man who believed the situation had already been resolved in his favor. "Ma'am, we executed a lawfully issued search warrant for these premises. Whatever you think is happening here, I know exactly what is happening here," she said. "And I know exactly what will happen next. You have the wrong address. This is my home. I am a federal judge, and you have the wrong address." Vance stood up. He looked around the kitchen with an expression that suggested mild interest and nothing else. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they have stopped listening. "You got something to hide in here, you can say so," he said. "Otherwise, my team does their job. You have the wrong address." That was 7. She had counted. Vance tilted his head and smiled again, and this time there was something else underneath it. Something satisfied and unhurried and deliberately unkind. He leaned down one more time, close enough that she could smell the gas station coffee on his breath, close enough that the gesture was designed to be read as dominance and nothing else. "Nobody's coming to save you," he said quietly. Then he straightened, turned, and called out toward the hallway. "Monroe, living room, clear it." The team moved. She heard them fan out through the arch, heard the sound of her living room being entered, heard the particular silence that follows when people are moving through a space they are treating as hostile. She closed her eyes for 2 breaths, opened them, stared at the skylight above her, at the pale gold morning pressing through the glass, at the light that had been so warm 40 seconds before her door came apart. She began to compose, mentally, everything she would need to remember. The time, the officer's name tape, the number of personnel, the location of the taser contact, the exact words that had been spoken to her. She was building a record the only way she could, from the kitchen floor, with her hands bound behind her, and she was doing it with the same precision she brought to everything. Then the movement in the living room stopped, all of it, at once. The shuffling of feet, the opening of drawers, the low radio chatter. It simply ceased. The way sound ceases when everyone in a room has simultaneously lost the ability to speak. 3 seconds of silence. Full, total, Absolute silence. Then Officer Tasha Monroe's voice came from the living room. Low, almost inaudible, stripped of every note of the tactical authority it had carried 60 seconds ago. "Lieutenant." A pause. "You need to come in here right now." Lieutenant Connor Vance walked like a man who wanted you to hear him coming. Heavy boots, shoulders set wider than his frame called for, 15 years of practiced authority in every step. He rounded the corner from the hallway into Dr. Ingrid Solberg's living room, expecting what these mornings usually gave him: mess, guilt, the small, clean feeling of having been right about the warrant. He stopped. Officer Tasha Monroe was 3 feet inside the room, and she wasn't moving. That was wrong. Monroe didn't freeze at scenes. She was the best room clearer they had, methodical to the point of irritation. Now she was flat-footed with her hands at her sides and her chin tipped up, staring at a wall. Vance followed her eyes. Light came down through a skylight, hard and honest. The walls were deep navy. A bookcase held legal volumes and 2 framed photographs of a woman in academic robes he didn't yet recognize. A reading chair sat at a careful angle next to a lamp. A coffee table held 1 legal journal, centered. Nothing in the room was out of place. Nothing had ever been out of place. Every object had been put where it was by someone who understood that a room speaks for you before you do. Then there was the wall. It had been arranged, curated. Vance felt something tilt under him that had nothing to do with the floor. In the middle of it, big enough to pull the whole room toward itself, hung a 16 by 20 photograph in dark, polished wood. He knew the room in the photograph. Everyone knew that room. Curved walls, the seal in the carpet, rose garden light coming softly through long windows. A woman in black judicial robes was shaking hands with the president. The president was smiling at her. She was smiling back, comfortable, with the ease of someone who had earned the chair beside the one she was standing next to. The woman was Dr. Ingrid Solberg, the same Dr. Ingrid Solberg, currently zip-tied on her own kitchen floor. Flanking the photograph in heavy gilded frames were 3 federal judicial appointment certificates, 1 from each of 3 different presidents. Below them, 4 matching frames in a careful row held Attorney General's commendations, 3 of them from 3 different AGs, each citing Solberg by name. Beside the commendations, a yellow-bordered front page from the American Federal Law Review. Vance had never read it. He didn't need to. The 10 most influential federal judges in the nation. Solberg was at the top of the list. Her photograph was beside her name. At the base of all of it, on a small brass bracket, was a nameplate, engraved, the kind people order once. The Honorable Dr. Ingrid Solberg, U.S. District Court Judge. Something in Vance's face went slack before he had decided to let it. He looked back at the wall, hoping it would read different the second time. It didn't. A cold thing moved through his chest, fast and stupid, the way the body figures out trouble before the mind agrees. He stood there a long second, eyes drifting from the photograph to the nameplate to the doorway behind him, looking for a way back into the version of this morning he'd had on the drive over, and not finding one. The room had gone completely quiet. The SWAT team members who had been moving through the space 30 seconds ago had stopped the way soldiers stop when a commanding officer raises a closed fist. No one spoke. Officer Tasha Monroe had turned her head very slightly toward Vance, not enough to look at him directly, but enough to watch him in her peripheral vision with the careful attention of a person who is already separating herself from what she is witnessing and filing it into memory. In the kitchen, Dr. Ingrid Solberg had gone silent. She was still on the floor, wrists still bound behind her back, the linoleum cold against her knees, the taser burn on her forearm, a fact that would be documented, photographed, and entered into a federal record within 3 hours. She had stopped speaking, Not because she had run out of things to say, and not because she had surrendered to the indignity of the floor beneath her. She had gone silent because silence, right now, was the most precise instrument she possessed. She was cataloging every voice, every boot step, every creak of the ransacked living room furniture. She was counting officers. She was estimating timestamps. She was filing the exact words Connor Vance had spoken to her in the hallway into the part of her mind where she stored testimony, the part that had been trained over 19 years to hold facts without distortion, to recall details without the softening that grief and anger could bring if a person let them. She had not let them. She was the most disciplined thinker in any room she had ever entered, and she was thinking now with the full force of everything she had built and everything she had studied and every case she had presided over that had begun exactly like this, with someone in power making a catastrophic error and believing, in those first few minutes, that they could still manage the consequences. She heard the boots stop in the living room. She heard the silence that followed. She understood what the silence meant before Vance had finished processing it himself. His footsteps came back toward the kitchen slowly. The swagger was gone from them. They were the footsteps of a man carrying new weight, the kind that does not redistribute evenly. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and for the first time since he had come through her front door, he did not look like a man who was in charge of anything. He cleared his throat. When he spoke, the performance was gone. The casual contempt, the coffee breath authority. What came out instead was a voice reaching for procedure the way a drowning man reaches for a rope. The warrant. He began, and he stopped, and he began again. This operation was executed in good faith based on credible intelligence. The warrant was lawfully obtained and lawfully served. If there are questions about the information that led to this address, that is a matter that will be reviewed through the appropriate. You should call your union rep. Her voice came from the floor. It was not loud. It was not shaking. It was the voice she used when she had already decided the outcome of something and was simply giving the other party the professional courtesy of knowing it before the gavel fell. It was 5 words, and they landed in the kitchen like a sentence being read aloud in open court. Precise, final, and already on the record. Vance stared at her. She looked back at him from the floor with the expression of a woman who has been in this position, not on her knees, but in possession of the decisive fact, 10,000 times. She did not need to stand up to be the most powerful person in the room. She had never needed the floor beneath her feet to confirm what she already knew about herself. Vance's hand moved to his radio. She watched it. His fingers found the device, and he pulled it from his vest with the slow, reluctant motion of a man performing an action he cannot reverse, the way a person signs a document that transfers something irreplaceable. His hand was not steady. She noticed that too, and she added it to the catalog. And she said nothing further because she did not need to. The radio crackled in his grip. The morning light continued pouring through the skylight, flooding the kitchen, illuminating everything without mercy. The broken door frame, the zip ties at her wrists, the taser burn on her arm, the brass nameplate visible from the hallway in its polished certainty, and Lieutenant Connor Vance standing in the kitchen of the wrong house, holding a radio with a trembling hand, already beginning to understand that the worst thing that had ever happened to him had happened the moment he drove to this address, and that the woman on his floor had known it before he did. The zip ties came off at 6:19 a.m. Officer Tasha Monroe knelt beside Dr. Ingrid Solberg on the kitchen floor with a small blade and hands that were not entirely steady. She cut through the plastic without a word. There was no apology in her mouth yet. That would come later, in a conference room, in front of federal agents, with a lawyer sitting beside her. But there was something in the way she kept her eyes down that told Dr. Ingrid Solberg everything she needed to know about what Tasha Monroe understood had just happened in that living room. Dr. Ingrid Solberg stood without assistance. She did not reach for the counter. She did not steady herself against the wall. She rose from that kitchen floor the same way she had risen from every hard thing in her life, fully upright, spine straight, both feet planted, and she stood in the center of her own kitchen under the warm pour of the morning skylight. And she took exactly 3 measured breaths. The SWAT team had gone quiet in a way that loud men rarely go quiet. It was the silence of people recalculating. They stood in doorways and hallways, holding equipment they no longer seemed to know what to do with. And the kitchen, her kitchen, with its case files still spread across the table and her coffee mug still holding warmth, felt like a room where something had broken that none of them had the tools to fix. Lieutenant Connor Vance had not come back from the living room yet. Dr. Ingrid Solberg looked at her wrists. The marks from the zip ties were already deepening into something that would need to be photographed. She noted this the same way she noted the shattered door frame at the end of the hall, the displaced books along the shelving unit, the muddy boot print pressed into the corner of her entry rug. She noted all of it the way a federal judge notes evidence, without emotion and without the intention of forgetting a single detail. She picked up her phone from the kitchen table. It was 6:21 a.m. She dialed Dominic Ashford. He answered on the second ring, and she did not begin with hello. She said his name once, then she spoke for 45 seconds in a voice that was low and precise and entirely without trembling. She told him what time the door came down. She told him about the taser and about the kitchen floor and about the zip ties. She told him about the warrant, the wrong address, the 7 times she had stated it clearly. She told him about the wall and about the expression on Lieutenant Connor Vance's face when he walked out of that living room, looking like a man who had just understood the specific gravity of his own mistake. Dominic Ashford listened without interrupting once. When she finished, there were 2 seconds of absolute silence on the line. Then he said, in a voice that carried 40 years of civil rights litigation behind every syllable, "Don't touch anything. I'm on my way." She hung up and dialed Judge Vivienne Castellano. Vivienne Castellano answered before the first ring had finished, which meant she had been awake, which meant she was already the kind of prepared that only lifelong federal judges manage to be at 6 in the morning. Dr. Ingrid Solberg gave her the same 45 seconds. Vivienne Castellano did not say she was sorry. She did not say she could not believe it. She said, "I have it," and she hung up. And Dr. Ingrid Solberg knew that somewhere across the city a second phone was already ringing, and then a third, and that the network she had spent 19 years building through competence and integrity and the specific discipline of showing up was now moving in her direction with a momentum that no incident report and no union script was going to slow down. Outside, Adayazi Nuosu had been awake since the armored vehicles rolled down the block. She lived 4 houses to the left, and she was a woman who knew her neighborhood the way a person knows their own heartbeat, the rhythms of it, the sounds that belonged and the sounds that didn't. The sound of heavy engines and tactical boots on residential pavement at 5:47 in the morning was a sound that did not belong, and so she had come outside in her orange top and blue jacket with her phone in her hand, and she had stood on her front lawn in the early morning light, and she had pressed record. She filmed the armored vehicle parked diagonally across the street. She filmed the SWAT officers standing in clusters near their vehicle. The rigid formation of 20 minutes ago now dissolved into something closer to uncomfortable groupings of people who did not know where to stand. She filmed Lieutenant Connor Vance pacing in a tight line near the passenger side of his vehicle, his hand on his radio, his jaw working around words he hadn't said yet. She zoomed in on his face once, briefly, and the footage would later show a man engaged in a very specific kind of calculation, the kind that happens when authority meets consequence, and consequence is winning. Then Dr. Ingrid Solberg appeared in her doorway. She stood in the frame of her own front entrance, green top twisted slightly at the left shoulder from the floor, wrists carrying marks that the morning light caught with unsparing clarity. And she looked out at the scene in her front yard and on her street with an expression that Adaeze Nosu would describe in every interview she gave over the next 4 months as the quietest fury she had ever seen in a human face. It was not rage in the way that shouts. It was something older and more precise than that. It was the face of a woman who was already 3 moves ahead of everyone standing on her lawn, who understood exactly what every detail she was looking at would mean inside a federal courtroom, and who was allowing herself exactly this one unguarded moment of standing in her own doorway before the work began. Adaeze Nosu kept the camera steady. She uploaded the video at 7:02 a.m. with a caption that said only, "This is my neighbor. She is a federal judge. This is what happened to her this morning." She included the address of the street, but not the house number. She tagged 3 journalists she had met at a community meeting 2 years prior. Then she stood on her lawn in the growing morning light and waited, because Adaeze Nosu was a woman who understood that some things, once set in motion, do not require pushing. By 7:45 a.m., the video had 40,000 views. Lieutenant Connor Vance received the call from Deputy Chief Gerald Simmons at 7:38 a.m. He was still on scene. There was no protocol in his training for how quickly to leave the premises of a mistake this size, and he took the call standing beside his vehicle with his back to the house, which meant his back was to the doorway, which meant he did not see Dr. Ingrid Solberg watching him from the window. Deputy Chief Gerald Simmons did not shout. Simmons was not a man who shouted. He was a man who delivered instructions in a tone that was nearly pleasant and entirely immovable, and what he delivered now was an order to submit a full incident report within the hour. He used phrases like procedural documentation and timeline clarity, in the way that administrators use precise language when they are still deciding which direction the wind is blowing. He told Vance to be thorough. He told Vance to be accurate. He used the word accurate twice. Vance said yes, sir, and hung up. He got into his vehicle and closed the door and sat in the sudden sealed quiet of the cab, and he stared at the steering wheel. The incident report. He needed to write the incident report. He had written incident reports before, 40 or 50 over the course of his career, and they had always been simple architectural work. You built a structure of language around what happened, and you emphasized the correct details, and you arranged the timeline in a way that placed the department's actions inside the frame of protocol. You used passive constructions where active ones were inconvenient. You referenced the warrant. You leaned hard on the phrase good faith execution. He knew how to do this. He had done this. But the living room wall kept coming back to him. The photograph, the nameplate, the gilded frames with signatures he recognized. He had stood in front of that wall for 4 seconds, and his entire understanding of the morning had restructured itself around a single central fact. He had tased and zip-tied a sitting United States District Court judge on the floor of her own home, and then crouched over her and told her nobody was coming to save her. He began composing sentences in his head. The warrant had been issued on credible intelligence from a registered confidential informant. All tactical procedures had been followed in accordance with department protocol. Upon entry, officers conducted a lawful search of the premises consistent with the scope of the warrant. The words felt like bricks. He was laying over a hole in the ground, and he could feel, even as he was laying them, that the hole was already too wide. Down the street, he could not see Adaeze Nosu's phone screen from where he sat. He could not see the number climbing past 40,000. He did not know that Judge Vivienne Castellano had already made 4 calls before 7 in the morning, or that Dominic Ashford was pressing 70 on the highway with his gray suit jacket folded across the passenger seat. He did not know that the story had already left the street. He did not know that the machinery he was trying to slow with a paragraph of departmental language had been moving since the moment Officer Tasha Monroe whispered his name in a living room doorway, and the silence that followed swallowed everything he thought he controlled. He only knew the steering wheel in front of him. He only knew he needed to write something before the hour was up. He started typing. Across the street, in the house he had broken into that morning, Dr. Ingrid Solberg sat at her kitchen table with her phone face up beside her case files, waiting for Dominic Ashford's car to appear at the end of her block. Her coffee had gone cold. Her door frame was shattered. Her wrists would bruise fully by noon. She was already building. Dominic Ashford pulled up to the address at 8:23 in the morning in a pressed gray suit, white shirt beneath the jacket, dark charcoal trousers sharp at the crease. He did not rush. Dominic Ashford had learned long ago that the men who rushed into scenes like this were the men who missed things, and he had not built a 22-year federal civil rights practice by missing things. He stepped out of his car, looked at the shattered front door frame, still hanging at a wrong angle against the morning light, and pulled out his phone. He started photographing before he even crossed the threshold. The overhead skylight inside Dr. Ingrid Solberg's home poured natural light across everything it had broken. The hallway runner was scuffed from boot traffic. A small side table near the entrance had been knocked crooked. A ceramic bowl that had once sat on it now in 3 pieces on the floor. Dominic photographed it. He moved through the living room, the wall of achievements still intact and blazing in the morning light. The furniture pushed off its careful geometry, a lampshade tilted, books pulled from a shelf and not returned. He photographed every inch of it. Then he walked into the kitchen and found Dr. Ingrid Solberg sitting at her table with her back perfectly straight, her green top still carrying the events of the morning in its wrinkles, a glass of water in front of her that she had not touched, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance with the focused stillness of a woman who was thinking 6 steps ahead of the room she was sitting in. Dominic sat down across from her without being invited and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Show me your arm." She extended it without ceremony. The taser burn was a dark, angry mark on the inside of her forearm, already deepening in color under the fluorescent kitchen light. Dominic photographed it from 3 angles, the phone's shutter clicking in the quiet of the kitchen. He noted the timestamp on each image. He said, "Both wrists." She placed them flat on the table. The zip tie marks were still visible, red grooves in the skin of both wrists that would take several days to fully fade. He photographed those too. "Walk me through it," he said. "From the beginning. Don't edit." So she did. Her voice never wavered, and she did not pause for effect. She described the sound of her door coming in, the shouting, the hallway, the taser, the floor, the zip ties, the cold tile against her cheek, and every single word that had come out of Lieutenant Connor Vance's mouth while he crouched over her with the posture of a man who had never once in his career considered that he might be wrong. She described Officer Tasha Monroe's face when she came back from the living room. She described the silence. She described Vance's voice going a different color when he finally saw the wall. Something thin and clipped, replacing the broad swagger he'd carried through her front door. She described saying the words, "You should call your union rep," and watching his hand go to his radio like it was the only thing he was certain of in that moment. Dominic listened to all of it without interrupting once. When she finished, he looked down at his notepad and said, "Vivienne already called the federal duty officer at 6:40. "I know," Ingrid said. "Byron Hutchins is getting the file." "Good. I need the warrant," he said. "I'm going to pull it myself, but I want to know if they left a copy." She slid a folded document across the table. She had already retrieved it from where a careless officer had left it on her kitchen counter, and she had already read it twice. Dominic unfolded it, smoothed it flat with one hand, and read it with the methodical pace of someone reading a contract they already suspect is fraudulent. After 40 seconds, he went very still. He read a single line again. "The address," he said. "One digit off," Ingrid said. "My address is 4714 Crestwood Lane. The warrant reads 47421. Dominic set the document on the table and looked at it. "A 10-second database cross-check," he said. "Less," she said. "A 10-second Google search would have done it." He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since arriving, something moved behind his composure. Not anger exactly. Something colder and more focused than anger. The expression of a man who had just identified the specific place where the structure was weakest and was already calculating how much pressure it would take to bring it down. He photographed the warrant. He photographed the address line. He photographed it again with his own hand pointing to the number so the image had irrefutable context. Then he put his phone away, recapped his pen, and stood up. "Don't touch the door frame," he said. "Don't sweep the hall. Don't replace anything until I have a second photographer through here." He paused. "Are you all right?" Ingrid looked at him for a moment. "I'm working on it," she said. He nodded once, which was the right response. He had the full warrant file within 2 hours. He sat in his car outside a federal clerk's office with the documents open across his lap in the flat overhead morning light, and he read through the informant documentation with a legal highlighter moving steadily across the page. The confidential informant was listed under a case number, which was standard procedure, but Dominic had spent 2 decades learning how to move through the architecture of procedural anonymity, and it took him 40 minutes to confirm what the cross-referenced case history strongly suggested. The informant was Leonard Crane. The name surfaced in 3 prior warrant filings associated with Lieutenant Connor Vance's unit over the past 4 years, each time under the same procedural protection, each time providing the foundational tip that initiated aggressive action. Dominic wrote the name on a clean page of his notepad and drew a box around it. Then he called Vivienne Castellano and gave her the name before he pulled out of the parking lot. On the other side of the city, in a federal field office where the ceiling lights were bright overhead panels and the morning sun came through the east-facing windows in long, clean slants, FBI Special Agent Byron Hutchins was already at his desk. He was a broad-shouldered man who wore his suits like they were a second layer of structure over something denser underneath, and he had the deliberate, unhurried quality of someone who had processed enough human wreckage to stop confusing urgency with speed. He had received Judge Vivienne Castellano's call at 7:18. He had opened the preliminary civil rights violation file at 7:22. By 9 o'clock he had the formal assignment, and he had started pulling everything attached to Leonard Crane's informant history. What he found did not surprise him in the way a revelation surprises. It surprised him the way a confirmed suspicion surprises. With a grim, settling weight that is somehow worse than not knowing, he spread the files across his desk in chronological order and read them the way a geologist reads strata, looking not at the individual layers, but at the whole shape of the thing they formed together. 4 years of documented tips from Leonard Crane, all flowing through Lieutenant Connor Vance's unit. 5 warrant executions. 5 aggressive SWAT-level responses. 5 addresses that shared the same profile. Affluent residential neighborhoods. Established streets with high property values. The kinds of addresses that had not, until recently, belonged to black homeowners. He pulled the individual case histories one by one and laid them beside each other on the desk until there was no more room, and he had to use the windowsill. A retired school principal in her home on a quiet cul-de-sac. A surgeon and his family in a house they had owned for 11 months. A contractor who had built his business from nothing over 20 years. An attorney. A college professor. In every case, Leonard Crane's tip had described the same vague architecture: a suspected narcotics operation, a reliable source, credible and actionable intelligence. In every case, the response had been disproportionate, immediate and violent in its procedural certainty. In every case, the tip had been false. In every case, the family had found themselves on the floor of their own home, with weapons pointed at them and the weight of the state crouched over their lives like it owned them. In every case, the matter had been quietly settled. Small payouts, sealed agreements, institutional silence, and Leonard Crane still circulating through the system, still credible on paper, still trusted by the one lieutenant who kept calling his number. Byron Hutchins sat back in his chair and looked at the files spread across every surface in front of him. The morning light through the east window was moving now as the sun climbed, casting longer angles across the documents, illuminating handwriting in the margins, department letterheads, the cold language of official incidents described in passive voice, as though no one had made any choices. He picked up a black marker from his desk. He opened the first file to the page where Lieutenant Connor Vance's name appeared in the incident command line and drew a slow, deliberate circle around it. He opened the second file. He circled the name. He did it again in the third file, his hand moving at the same measured pace. The marker's sound against the paper the only noise in the room. Fourth file. The circle went down clean and closed. Fifth file. He circled the name a final time and set the marker on the desk and looked at what he had built. 5 circles, 5 families, 5 addresses that a man with a badge had decided needed to be reminded of something, that a certain kind of neighborhood came with a certain kind of belonging, and that belonging could be interrupted at any hour by a loud knock that was really not a knock at all. And now there was a 6th. Except this time the floor of that kitchen had belonged to a United States District Court judge, and the silence that had followed Officer Tasha Monroe's voice saying, "Lieutenant, you need to come in here right now," was not the silence of containment. It was the silence of a door swinging open onto something that could no longer be managed, settled, sealed, or made quiet. Byron Hutchins picked up his phone and called Dominic Ashford. "I have the pattern," he said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Dominic said, "So do I." Neither man said anything else for a moment, because there was nothing to say yet that the files hadn't already said louder and in permanent ink. Byron Hutchins looked at the 5 circles one more time, then reached for his notebook and started writing the name Leonard Crane at the top of a new page. It was not yet noon. The number on Adazi Nwosu's phone kept climbing too fast to actually read. At 11:47, the counter on her video passed 1 million and just kept going. The algorithm had picked up on something: real outrage, raw footage, a woman with bruised wrists standing in her own doorway, and a face that did the work of about 10 captions. Adazi had caught Ingrid Solberg in full morning sun, green top, still twisted at the hem, chin level, eyes tracking down the street like she was already drafting the verdict in her head. By 11:30, 3 networks had emailed her. She ignored them. She'd spoken to Dominic Ashford at 9:15. And he'd been blunt about it. "Don't talk to anyone. You're a witness. The footage is evidence. Sit tight." Adeza understood. She'd lived on that street 11 years, and she knew exactly what kind of person Ingrid Solberg was. She sat at her kitchen table watching the number go up and felt something she'd have trouble naming later. Not satisfaction. Closer to the feeling of a door that had been wedged shut for a long time, finally starting to give. Deputy Chief Gerald Simmons ran his office on the 4th floor of the Central Precinct, like a man who thought information was water, and he was the dam. For 22 years, that had worked out fine. He wasn't corrupt the way Leonard Crane was corrupt, or the way Vance was. His version was quieter, more institutional. He'd figured out a long time ago that the real risk in police work wasn't misconduct. It was misconduct that other people could see. His whole job, as he understood it, was keeping things from being seen. He called Connor Vance into the office at 10:20 and didn't offer him a chair. Vance stood in front of the desk in his short-sleeved uniform shirt, hands behind his back, pretending to a composure he didn't have. The overhead fluorescents were unforgiving. They always were in that office. Simmons talked for 9 minutes. Procedural compliance, good faith warrant execution, exigent circumstances interpretation, scope of authorized entry. That vocabulary. He handed Vance a printed page and called it the department's preliminary position. Study it. Don't talk to anyone except the union rep. The story is manageable if you don't make it worse. He believed all of it. He'd managed stories before, and he'd managed them well. He was wrong. At 1:14, his desk phone rang, and a communications officer told him there was a press conference scheduled for 2 o'clock in front of the Solberg residence, run by Dominic Ashford. Simmons set the phone down, sat there for a minute, then he picked it back up and called the city's legal counsel, and that call lasted 6 minutes, and when it was over, he looked again at the page he'd handed Vance, the tidy little script about procedural compliance, and finally understood that the thing he'd built that morning was paper. The sidewalk in front of Ingrid Solberg's house was under a wide cloudless sky, and the light was the kind that doesn't forgive anything. 3 camera crews were set up by 1:45, reporters in loose clusters. A neighbor 2 houses down, watching from her porch, the door of the Solberg house, frame repaired that morning by a contractor Ashford had arranged, closed behind them as they stepped out together at 1:58. Ashford was tall, early 50s, charcoal suit, white shirt, dark tie. 1 sheet of paper folded in half. No podium. He stood on the top step with Solberg to his left and slightly behind him, so the cameras had both of them clean. Solberg was wearing a fresh green top and a blue jacket. She'd pressed them herself that morning, and not for the cameras. Her wrists showed at the cuffs, and the marks from the zip ties were still there. Not staged, just there, the way bruises on a person are there. Her posture was straight. Her hands were down at her sides. There was nothing on her face that read as performance. She just looked present. Ashford unfolded the paper. He didn't raise his voice. At 5:47 the previous morning, he said, a SWAT team operating under Lieutenant Connor Vance of the City Police Department had unlawfully forced entry into the private residence of Dr. Ingrid Solberg, a federal district court judge. Solberg had been hit with a conducted electrical weapon in her own hallway before she'd been given any real chance to identify herself. She'd been restrained on her kitchen floor for roughly 14 minutes. The warrant used to justify the raid had an address error that a basic cross-reference would have caught before anyone was deployed. A federal civil rights complaint had been filed that morning with the Department of Justice. More was coming. He folded the paper and looked into the nearest camera. Then he stepped back, and Ingrid Solberg stepped forward. She did not take the paper. She did not look down. She looked at the cameras with the same expression she used when delivering a ruling that she knew would be cited for decades, and she said, in a voice that required no amplification, I have served this country's justice system for 19 years. I will allow that system to do its work. She stepped back. Dominic Ashford thanked the press. Questions erupted from 11 directions simultaneously. He raised one hand and said they would not be taking questions at this time. They turned and walked back to the door, and it closed behind them with a sound that was very quiet and very final. The clip of those 2 sentences ran on the first national broadcast at 4 p.m. By 5:30 p.m. it had been isolated, captioned, and shared 400,000 times. It was not the words themselves that people could not stop watching. It was the stillness. It was the fact that a woman who had been tased in her own hallway 14 hours earlier was standing in afternoon light with marked wrists and a pressed blue jacket and sounding like the most composed person in any room on the planet. It did something to people. It made them want to know what happened next, and it made them furious about what had already happened. And those 2 feelings together are what the internet runs on. At 6:47 p.m., Lieutenant Connor Vance received a text from his union representative that said only, "Call me when you see the news." He was still in his vehicle, He had been driving without destination for most of the afternoon, which was something he did when he needed to feel that motion and control were the same thing. He pulled into a parking structure on the west side of downtown and stopped on the second level under the overhead fluorescent panels that cast everything in their flat, even light. He found the press conference clip on his phone. He watched it once. The dam Simmons had built for him lasted exactly as long as it took Dominic Ashford to unfold that piece of paper. Every phrase Simmons had given him, procedural compliance, good faith execution, exigent circumstances, evaporated on contact with the specific language of the complaint being read aloud on a public sidewalk in front of news cameras. His name, the taser, the zip ties, the address error, his name again. He watched Dr. Ingrid Solberg's sentence one more time. 19 years. I will allow that system to do its work. His phone buzzed with a second text, then a third. He did not read them. At 7:22 p.m., FBI Special Agent Byron Hutchins received a call from a number he did not recognize. The attorney on the other end identified herself as representing Officer Tasha Monroe, currently of Vance's SWAT unit. The attorney said that her client wished to submit a voluntary witness statement and had chosen to do so through federal channels rather than internal department process. She asked if that was possible. Byron Hutchins, sitting at a desk covered in files and circled names, said yes, tonight as soon as she could get there. The call ended. He looked at the files in front of him and began organizing space for another one. The statement Officer Tasha Monroe gave that evening was 41 paragraphs long. It corroborated Dr. Ingrid Solberg's account of the morning in full. It contradicted Lieutenant Connor Vance's official incident report at 4 specific points. The number of verbal identifications Dr. Solberg made before the taser was deployed, the timeline of the warrant being produced, the description of her behavior as threatening, and the claim that the discovery of her credentials was made after the residence was cleared. Monroe stated that she had seen the wall within minutes of entry. She stated that she had called Vance into the living room immediately. She stated that she had felt, from the moment she saw the nameplate on that wall, that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong, and that she was not willing to stand behind a report that said otherwise. In the parking garage, Connor Vance watched the press conference clip a 4th time. The fluorescent light above his car hummed steadily. The concrete walls held no sound. He sat very still, which was the opposite of what he had been doing all day, and the stillness did not feel like control. It felt like the moment just before a structure announces, without drama or warning, that it can no longer hold the weight it has been asked to carry. He had been given a story to tell. The story was already gone. And somewhere across the city, the files were multiplying. The fluorescent lights inside Federal Building Room 1114 ran at full overhead brightness, the kind of institutional glare that flattened shadows and left no comfortable corners for a man to retreat into. It was 9:14 in the morning, 36 hours after a SWAT team had put a sitting federal judge on her kitchen floor. An FBI Special Agent Byron Hutchins had been in this building since 6. He sat across a bolted steel table from Leonard Crane, and he did not look rushed. That was the first thing Crane noticed. The agent was not rushed. Byron Hutchins was broad-shouldered in a dark navy suit, a man whose physical presence did not require announcement, and he had arranged 5 manila folders on the table between them, with the kind of deliberate patience that told you he had all day and found this particular morning almost unremarkable. Leonard Crane was 43 years old, narrow-faced, wearing a gray thermal undershirt and dark cargo pants, and his attorney, a public defender who had reviewed the situation for 12 minutes, sat beside him doing the careful math of someone who already understood the outcome. Byron Hutchins opened the first folder. He did not speak for a moment. He simply turned a document to face Leonard Crane and let the man read. Marcus Williams, 2019, Byron Hutchins said. You provided the tip. SWAT response. Homeowner detained for 4 hours. No drugs found, no arrest, settled out of court by the city for $60,000. Marcus Williams was a cardiovascular surgeon. He had lived at that address for 3 years. Leonard Crane kept his face neutral. This was not his first room like this. Byron Hutchins opened the second folder. Diane Okafor, 2020. You provided the tip. SWAT response. Homeowner thrown against a wall. 2 fractured ribs. No contraband found. No arrest. Internal Affairs filed a report that was closed 48 days later without disciplinary action. Diane Okafor was a tenured professor of constitutional law. The attorney shifted in his seat. Crane said nothing. Byron Hutchins opened the 3rd folder, then the 4th, then the 5th. He read each one the same way: the name, the year, the tip, the response, the outcome, the occupation. 5 names, 5 addresses, 5 destroyed mornings in 5 immaculate homes. And then Byron Hutchins placed a single printed phone record on top of all 5 folders, oriented so that Leonard Crane could read it perfectly clearly under the overhead fluorescent lights. The night before the raid on Dr. Ingrid Solberg's residence, Byron Hutchins said, "Your phone contacted a number registered to a personal cell phone belonging to Lieutenant Connor Vance. The call lasted 11 minutes and 22 seconds. That was not Vance calling you with a tip to develop. That call was too long for that, Mr. Crane. 11 minutes is a conversation. 11 minutes is instructions." The silence in room 1114 ran for approximately 8 seconds. Then Leonard Crane looked at his attorney, and his attorney looked at the 5 open folders, and something passed between them that required no words at all. It took Leonard Crane 19 more minutes to say everything. Byron Hutchins did not interrupt once. The arrangement had begun 4 years earlier, Crane explained, with his voice dropping to something that no longer resembled performance. Vance had approached him after a street-level drug case in which Crane had served as a cooperating witness. Vance had made it simple. Crane would receive reduced charges on a pending possession case, and in return he would build credible-sounding tips whenever Vance brought him an address. Vance provided the addresses, Crane provided the language, the invented surveillance details, the invented associate names, the invented behavioral observations that turned a residential address into something that looked, on paper, like a warrant-worthy target. The tips never needed to hold up after the fact because the response was always the point. The fear was the point. The door coming off its hinges at 5 in the morning was the point. Crane confirmed what Byron Hutchins had already begun to suspect. The selection of targets was not random, and it was not operational. Lieutenant Connor Vance had been choosing addresses in specific neighborhoods, newer construction, higher property values, streets that had shifted in the last decade, and the people inside those addresses were, without exception, Black professionals who had purchased in those areas within the last 5 years. Vance had never articulated his reasoning to Crane in those precise terms. He had not needed to. He had simply referred to certain neighborhoods as places that were changing in the wrong direction, and Crane, who needed his arrangement more than his conscience, had never asked him to explain further. Leonard Crane named 2 other officers from Vance's unit, Officer Patrick Garrow and Officer Dale Sutter, who had been present during at least 2 of the prior incidents, and who Crane stated had been verbally briefed by Vance on the arrangement before those particular raids. They had not objected. They had participated. Crane provided dates and stated that he had a text message from Garrow on his personal phone referencing one of the prior addresses. Byron Hutchins closed his notepad, capped his pen, and stood. The FBI arrested Leonard Crane at 11:07 that morning. He was processed and transferred, and his attorney began the paperwork for a cooperation agreement before noon. Federal arrest warrants for Officer Patrick Garrow and Officer Dale Sutter were signed and transmitted to the U.S. Magistrate by 1:30 p.m. Both men were in custody before 3 o'clock. Deputy Chief Gerald Simmons received the news about the warrants from his assistant, who knocked on his office door at 1:48 p.m. and slid a single printed memo across his desk. Gerald Simmons read it twice, He sat for a moment in his office chair, which faced a window looking out over the city, and he thought about the scripted narrative he had handed Vance 3 days earlier, the good faith warrant execution language, the procedural compliance framing, the story he had believed could be managed. He thought about the calls he had not returned from 3 city council members. He thought about the 5 names Byron Hutchins had now placed on the official record, names Gerald Simmons recognized because he had seen those internal affairs files himself 4 years ago and had accepted the closures without pressing further. Gerald Simmons picked up his personal cell phone and called Chief Veronica Stanton's direct line. She answered on the first ring. He did not offer a preface. He told her he had internal communications he had not previously disclosed, that he had been attempting to manage the situation at a departmental level, and that he understood he had miscalculated both the scope of the investigation and his own position within it. He said he would hand over every internal communication in his possession within the hour. Chief Veronica Stanton listened to all of this and said very little in return because there was very little that required a response. When Simmons finished, she told him she would have someone at his office in 45 minutes, and she thanked him with a flatness in her voice that communicated precisely nothing about what would come next for him. At 4:15 p.m., Chief Veronica Stanton stood in front of the cameras outside police headquarters in a pressed navy dress uniform and delivered a statement that ran to 9 paragraphs. She confirmed the FBI civil rights investigation, confirmed the arrests of Leonard Crane, Patrick Garrow, and Dale Sutter, and confirmed that effective immediately Lieutenant Connor Vance was suspended without pay pending the outcome of both criminal and internal disciplinary proceedings. She did not editorialize. She used the word accountability 4 times. She used the phrase every resident of this city 3 times. She said the department's obligation was not to protect its worst actors from consequences, but to stand clearly and without hesitation on the right side of those consequences. She said Dr. Ingrid Solberg's name once, directly, and prefaced it with the word honorable. The press conference was 17 minutes long and was carried live on 4 stations. Dominic Ashford watched it on his laptop in Dr. Ingrid Solberg's dining room, where he had been working for most of the afternoon with printed filings spread across her restored oak table. When Veronica Stanton finished speaking, Dominic Ashford removed his reading glasses, set them on top of a folder, and picked up his phone. Dr. Ingrid Solberg answered on the second ring. Stanton just suspended him, Dominic said, without pay. Crane is in custody. So are Garrow and Sutter. The line was quiet for a moment, and Crane confirmed the targeting was intentional, Dominic said. He confirmed Vance gave him the address. All 5 prior cases tie directly back to Vance's unit. Byron has the text messages, the phone records, and a full cooperation agreement. This is not going to be resolved at the departmental level, Ingrid. This is federal, and it is going all the way. Another quiet moment. Not the silence of someone who had not heard. The silence of someone who had already known, and who was now holding the confirmation like an object that weighed more than she had expected. Thank you, Dominic. Dr. Ingrid Solberg said. She was sitting in her living room. The afternoon light came through the tall windows in long natural panels, filling the room with the kind of clear illumination that softened nothing. Her door had been temporarily repaired. The frame still showed the marks where the battering ram had connected, but the living room itself had been set right. The furniture was back in its precise positions. The photographs were rehung. The framed commendations sat level in their gilded frames along the wall, and the brass nameplate caught the afternoon light exactly as it always had. She sat for a long time without moving, looking at that wall. She looked at the photograph of herself in judicial robes, standing beside the president in the Oval Office, both of them mid-laugh, caught in a moment of genuine warmth by whoever had held the camera. She looked at the 3 commendations from 3 consecutive attorneys general, each one signed by hand. She looked at the framed journal cover, at her own name printed in the formal font of institutional recognition. She looked at the nameplate. She had earned every single thing on that wall. She had worked through every door that had tried to remain closed, had argued cases that reshaped how federal courts understood civil procedure, had sat through confirmation hearings and early mornings and late nights until the work became indistinguishable from her own breathing. She had built this room, and this life, and this name, and a man who considered her address to be an error of geography had sent a team to her door in the dark to make her feel like a stranger inside it. She had been right about everything. She sat quietly in the afternoon light, looking at her wall, and she did not say a single word, because being right about everything, every piece of it, every name, every pattern, every deliberate cruelty, was not something a person celebrated. It was something a person carried. The federal grand jury returned its indictment on a Tuesday morning, 22 days after the raid. Dr. Ingrid Solberg learned the news the way she learned most important things, not from a phone call, not from a headline, but from attorney Dominic Ashford, who knocked on her open chamber door at 8:47 a.m. and stood in the doorway with his gray suit pressed and his expression carrying the particular gravity of a man who had worked very hard for something and was now watching it land. He said, "It's done." She set down her pen. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Read them to me." He did. Civil rights conspiracy under federal statute, filing a false official report, orchestrating an unlawful search and seizure. A fourth charge related to the pattern of conduct Byron Hutchins had documented across all 5 prior cases. Lieutenant Connor Vance, who had crouched over her on a kitchen floor 22 days ago with contempt in his eyes and authority borrowed from a fraudulent warrant, was now a federally indicted man. Leonard Crane had already entered his guilty plea to conspiracy charges that morning, his cooperation agreement signed and filed, his testimony locked in and on record. The 2 additional officers from Vance's unit had accepted plea deals 2 days prior. The architecture of the operation Vance had built, the informant network, the fabricated tips, the deliberate and systematic harassment of black professionals in neighborhoods he had decided they did not belong in, was fully documented, fully exposed, and fully collapsing under the weight of its own recorded evidence. Dominic Ashford finished reading. The chamber was quiet. Overhead, the fluorescent lights hummed their steady, indifferent note. Morning skylight fell through the high window behind Ingrid's desk in a clean white rectangle, warming the edge of her bookshelf, catching the gold lettering on the spines of 3 volumes of federal procedure she had annotated herself. "Thank you, Dominic," she said. He nodded once and left, pulling the door to a quiet close behind him. She sat for a moment, with her hands flat on the desk. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. But that is only the surface of what that morning was. That is the version of Dr. Ingrid Solberg that the world would see. Composed, precise, returning to her work as though the past 22 days had been merely an inconvenience efficiently resolved. And that version was true. It was also incomplete, because the 22 days between the raid and the indictment had not been simple. They had not been clean. They had been the kind of days that do not announce their difficulty until you are already in the middle of them, already standing in your own kitchen at 3 a.m. in the overhead light, making tea you do not want, aware that you are awake because sleep has become a place where the sound of boots on a door can reach you. She had not told anyone about the sleeplessness. Not Dominic, not Vivienne, not a single colleague. She had arrived at the courthouse every morning with her green top pressed and her posture immaculate, and she had presided over her docket with the same measured authority she had spent 19 years building, and no one who looked at her could have located the fracture. She did not think of this as pretending. She thought of it as precision, the same discipline that had carried her through law school at 23, through her first federal appointment at 31, through every day in every courtroom where she had walked in knowing that some part of the room expected her to be smaller than she was. You do not survive 19 years on the federal bench by letting the fractures show, but they were there. 10 days after the raid, on a bright morning with natural light blazing off the concrete, she had driven to the courthouse and pulled into her designated spot in the parking structure and then sat in the car for 4 minutes without getting out. She had her briefcase, she had her identification, she had 19 years of documented, unimpeachable service, and her name on an appointment signed by the President of the United States. And she had sat in that car and had to quietly, methodically remind herself that she had every right to walk through that door, that the building on the other side of the parking structure was not a place she was permitted to enter by someone else's grace, that it was a place she had earned repeatedly without question, and that what had happened in her hallway 22 days ago, the taser, the zip ties, the smirk above her, while she said for the 7th time that they had the wrong address, that none of that changed the truth of who she was or what she had built. It took her 4 minutes to get there. Then she got out of the car. She had not told anyone about those 4 minutes either. 11 days after the raid, Judge Vivienne Castellano had come to Ingrid's chambers at the end of the day's session, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the building's 2nd-floor cafe, wearing her own robe still unbuttoned at the front, and she had sat across from Ingrid in the chair that Ingrid's clerks used, and she had not asked how she was doing. Vivienne knew better than that. Instead, she had set 1 coffee in front of Ingrid and said, "Tell me what you're not telling anyone." There was a long pause. The overhead lights were steady. The skylight had shifted to its late afternoon amber, and it lay across the corner of the room like something warm and uninvited. Ingrid looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Then she said, "It worked." Vivienne did not speak. She waited. Ingrid said, "The raid. What he designed it to do, it worked. Not for long, not permanently, but for that morning, for those hours on my kitchen floor, and for some of the hours afterward. It made me feel like I did not belong in my own home, in my own life, in this building." She paused. "That is what it was built to do. And I want to be honest, at least once, with at least one person, that it achieved that. For a moment, it achieved exactly that." Vivienne was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know." 2 words, but they carried everything. The recognition, the weight of shared understanding between 2 women who had both spent careers walking into rooms that had not been built with them in mind, who had both learned the precise internal architecture required to keep standing when someone tried to make you feel like a mistake. Ingrid picked up her coffee. "I won't let it matter," she said. "I know that too," Vivienne said. They sat together in the quiet of the chambers until the amber light faded, and neither of them needed to say anything more. Dominic Ashford had checked in on her in his own way, more practical, more organized, the way he did everything. He had sent her daily updates on the case progression, brief and precise, always ending with a single line of personal acknowledgement. He had brought her the documentation of Leonard Crane's pattern on day 7, and when she had read through the 5 prior files, 5 other families, 5 other black homeowners, 5 other quiet mornings shattered by boots and contempt, she had set the folder down and looked out the window for a long time. The anger she felt was not the hot, uncontrolled kind. It was architectural, structural, the kind of anger that does not burn itself out, but instead becomes load-bearing, becomes the thing you build the next 19 years on top of. She had called each of the 5 families herself. 4 of the 5 calls, she had done the listening. Now, on Tuesday morning, 22 days after the raid, with the indictment on record and Dominic Ashford's footsteps fading down the hall outside her closed chamber door, Dr. Ingrid Solberg sat at her desk for exactly 3 more minutes. Then she stood. Her green top was pressed and clean, its collar sitting crisp at the base of her throat. Her desk was organized, her case files stacked and tabbed in the order of the morning's docket. On the hook behind her chamber door, her black judicial robes hung with the particular stillness of something that has been waiting. She lifted them from the hook. They were heavier than people imagined. Not physically, though the fabric had weight and substance, but in the accumulated meaning of every time she had put them on. The first time, at 34, in a courtroom in this same building, alone in a clerk's room, her hands steady because she had made them steady. Every time since, every morning she had dressed and walked down this hall and taken her seat and called a court to order and done the work of the law with precision and integrity, and had never, not once, needed anyone's permission to be there. She pulled the robes on, settled them across her shoulders, smoothed the front with both hands. There was a mirror on the wall beside the door, a small practical thing, installed for exactly this purpose, checking that the robes sat correctly before stepping into the hall. She looked into it for a moment. The woman looking back at her was not the woman who had been on her kitchen floor 22 days ago. She was also not entirely separate from her. She was the same woman who had lain on that floor, counted her breaths, said for the 7th time that they had the wrong address, and known with complete certainty, even then, that this moment was coming. This mirror, these robes, this hall. She straightened the collar one final time. Then she opened her chamber door, stepped into the corridor, where the overhead fluorescent lights ran the full length of the ceiling in a clean, unbroken line, and walked toward the courtroom. Her footsteps were even. Her posture was exact. Behind her, her chamber door swung to a quiet close, and in the room she had left, the morning skylight fell across her empty desk, across the stacked files and the organized tabs and the pen she had set down, and held the whole careful order of it in a stillness that looked, to anyone who might have glanced in through the small glass pane, like nothing more than a room waiting for its occupant to return. Which was exactly right. She had work to do. The federal courthouse, on a Tuesday morning in late October, holds a particular kind of silence before it fills. The kind that doesn't feel like quiet so much as pressure, air compressed by the weight of what is about to happen inside it. By 8:15 in the morning, every seat in courtroom 7 was taken. Journalists, legal scholars, community members who had driven through the night from 3 different states. The overhead fluorescent lights blazed without apology across the high ceiling, and the morning skylight poured clean, cold October sun through the tall windows above the gallery, washing the entire room in a brightness that left nowhere to hide. Connor Vance walked through the side entrance at 8:22. He was wearing an orange shirt and a blue jacket, civilian clothes that looked like they had been chosen carefully to project something, normalcy maybe, or humility. Neither landed. His defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Patterson, who moved with practiced calm, kept one hand loosely at his side and guided Vance to the defense table without making eye contact with anyone in the gallery. Vance sat down. He placed both hands flat on the table and stared at the surface of it. His posture, once a thing he had worn like a weapon, shoulders wide, chin lifted, the posture of a man who believed he owned whatever room he entered, was something smaller now, compressed, like a structure that had lost its load-bearing wall and was being held up by habit alone. The gallery stirred, papers shuffled. Someone near the back whispered something and was hushed. The bailiff moved to his position and called the room to order. Every person in courtroom 7 rose to their feet. The door behind the bench opened. Dr. Ingrid Solberg entered in her full judicial robes, black, pressed, precise, and walked to the bench without hurrying. She set her documents down with deliberate care. She adjusted the brass nameplate that read, "A Honorable Dr. Ingrid Solberg, U.S. District Court Judge." And then she sat down and looked at the room. She did not look at Vance first. She looked at the room, all of it, and allowed the room to settle into the fact of her presence. Then she looked at him. Connor Vance was already looking at her. He had been unable to stop himself. And in the time it took him to hold that gaze for 3 seconds before dropping his eyes back to the table, he experienced something that no attorney, no union representative, no internal affairs handler had been able to prepare him for. The last time he had seen that face, it was below him. It was on a kitchen floor. It was speaking to him with a composure he had read as weakness, and he had laughed at it, and he had crouched over it with everything he thought he was. The bench was elevated. He had always known this intellectually. He had been in courtrooms before, standing where he stood now, and the elevation had meant nothing to him because the person above him had never been someone he had tased in a hallway and left zip-tied on linoleum while his team knocked picture frames off shelves. Today, the elevation felt architectural, biblical, like something the building itself had decided. The hearing began. Motions were addressed in sequence. The federal charges were read into the record by the clerk in a voice that was professional and unhurried, and every word of it, civil rights conspiracy, filing a false official report, orchestrating an unlawful search and seizure, settled into the room like stones dropped into still water. Patterson raised 3 procedural objections. 2 were noted, 1 was denied. Dr. Ingrid Solberg moved through the hearing with the same methodical precision she had applied to every case file she had ever reviewed, including the one she had been sitting with at her kitchen table at 5:47 in the morning when the front door of her home had been turned into splinters. She did not rush. She did not perform. When Patterson rose to present his argument for leniency consideration based on his client's years of service, 17 years, decorated unit, commendations, a pension, Dr. Ingrid Solberg allowed him to finish. She wrote something in the margin of her document. She set her pen down. She looked up. The room went the specific kind of quiet that rooms go when they understand that what comes next will matter. "Counsel," she said. And her voice was the same voice that had said you have the wrong address 7 times on a hallway floor. And it had not changed at all. Not in pitch, not in steadiness, not in the absolute refusal to be diminished. "This court acknowledges the record of service you have submitted. It is noted. What must also be noted, and what this court considers of equal and arguably greater weight, is the nature of the obligation that service implies." She paused. Not for effect, because the next sentence required space around it. "Authority is not a credential. It is a responsibility. Every person granted the power to enter another person's home, to carry a weapon, to act in the name of this country's law, accepts with that power an obligation to uphold the dignity of every human being they encounter. Every one. Without condition, without exception, without the private calculation of who belongs where, or who looks like what, or who can be dismissed because their protests, no matter how precise, no matter how repeated, do not fit the narrative that was brought to their door." She looked at Vance. He was not looking at the table anymore. He was looking at her, and there was nothing left in his face to arrange. When that obligation is not merely neglected, but deliberately inverted, when authority becomes the instrument of targeted cruelty, the consequences must be proportionate to what was destroyed. And what was destroyed here was not property. It was not procedure. What was destroyed, intentionally and by design, was the premise that the law applies to everyone equally. This court takes that destruction seriously. This court will continue to do so. She returned to her documents. The hearing concluded 12 minutes later. Dr. Ingrid Solberg stepped down from the bench, gathered her papers with the same care she had set them down with, and walked through the door behind the bench without a backward glance. Outside the courthouse, the October sun was full and direct. No clouds to filter it. The stone steps of the building lit up like something deliberately chosen. A bank of reporters and cameras waited on the sidewalk. Dominic Ashford stood to her left, Judge Vivienne Castellano to her right. Neither of them spoke first. This was not their moment to fill. Dr. Ingrid Solberg stepped to the edge of the top step and looked at the cameras and did not begin by speaking about Connor Vance. "There are 5 other families," she said. "I want to begin there because this story does not begin with me, and it should not end with me either. 5 other families in this city, 5 black homeowners, were targeted by the same network, the same informant, the same pattern of deliberate, racially motivated harassment, dressed in the language of law enforcement procedure. Their doors were broken. Their mornings were taken from them. Most of them did not have a wall of federal appointments. Most of them settled quietly because they had no other road. I want those families to know that this proceeding saw them. This record named them. This city owes them more than a settlement check and a non-disclosure clause." She let that land. "My door has been repaired. My wrists healed weeks ago. My name is unchanged. I am still the Honorable Dr. Ingrid Solberg, and I will be on that bench tomorrow morning reviewing cases because that is what I do. That is what I have always done." The raid was designed to make me feel like a trespasser in my own life. It worked for approximately 45 minutes, and then it became evidence. She did not smile. She did not perform satisfaction. "Thank you," she said. And she turned and walked back up the steps and through the door of the courthouse. And the cameras kept rolling because the reporters were expecting something more, some final flourish, some punctuation of triumph. But there was no flourish. There was only the door closing behind her and the sound of her footsteps in the marble corridor, steady and unhurried, and already moving toward the next case, the next file, the next person who needed the law to mean what it said. She had work to do. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.